Okay, thank you very much. Before we actually get into the meat of the meeting, I'd also like to introduce those members of the public and the press who are watching the live stream of this meeting via the council's website. Minutes of the meeting will be produced in the usual manner, and a recording of the meeting will be available to view on the meeting page of the council's website. The County Council allows filming and photography of its public meetings, so please feel free to take pictures and tweet during the meeting. Can I ask, though, that everyone present turns off their mobile phones to silent or vibrate while the meeting is taking place? I've been informed there's no fire alarm test scheduled for today, so if the alarm sounds, I'll adjourn the meeting and we'll all make our way downstairs via the nearest available fire exit, which I'm assuming is that one over there. The muster point is in the car park to the rear of the building. In a few minutes, when the meeting's underway, I'll ask everybody to introduce themselves in terms of their name, their role, and the sector they're representing. Also, if you want to make a comment during this meeting, I'm hoping you've all worked out exactly how to do that using the control in front of you, which is to press the figure at the bottom of the screen, and that will enable you then to speak. For those members that are attending virtually, please keep your video camera switched on for the duration of the meeting and keep your microphone muted, except when I invite you to speak. Any members attending virtually wishing to ask questions or make a comment should indicate by clicking the raised hand function on the right-hand side of their screen, and we'll do our best to make sure that we notice that you're speaking or wish to speak on the virtual screen and ask you then to do so. So that's the introduction to the meeting. I'm now going to hand over to Tamar, really, for the first key action of this academic year.
So John Culpin has agreed to continue in the role of chair of the forum for this academic year. Please can I check that forum are in agreement for John to continue as chair by a show of hands? Unanimous? So yes, that's unanimous. So John, can you now go on to...
Thank you. I should have said at the start, if anybody did want to step into the role of chair, I wasn't going to stop you. But thank you for your vote of confidence. So we now need to actually appoint a vice chair. It's quite a key role, this. Although we don't have that many meetings to form over the course of the year, the nature of my role sometimes means that I'm not able to always chair the meeting. And it is actually quite a good experience to have somebody else stepping up to be vice chair. So Tamar, have you received any nominations in advance?
No, I haven't, no.
In which case then, casting my eye around the room, would anybody like to step forward, please, to be the vice chair for forum for this academic year? I noticed now various people looking away from me when I asked that question. All nominations will need someone to second. Sorry, Richard. Thank you. So we have one nomination, which is Richard Spencer. Can anybody sort of second Richard for this role? We have received a number of people who have done so. So all those in favour, please, can you vote? In which case, I'm pleased to announce Richard Spencer as Vice Chair of Forum. Thank you very much. Okay, we're now going to go down around the room, and I'd like you please then to introduce yourselves, as we actually do have a number of new members of Forum this year, and also it's very useful for people who are watching the live stream. So I'm going to begin with myself and then turn to the left. So for those who don't know, and again for those watching on the live stream, I'm Jonathan Culpin. I'm CEO of Anglian Learning Multi-Academy Trust, based in Cambridgeshire, Essex, and Suffolk, and I'm representing the academy sector. So I'll hand over now to John Lewis.
Hi, Jonathan Lewis. I'm Director of Education for Cambridgeshire County Council. I'm Martin Wade. I'm Strategic Finance Manager at Cambridgeshire County Council.
Richard Scott, I'm the Principal at Thomas Clarkson Academy, Secondary Academies.
I'm Peter Law. I'm Principal at Comberson Village College and I co-chair Cambridgeshire Secondary Head Teachers.
Hi, I'm Joanne Hardwick, Head Teacher at Samuel Pepys School in St Neots, representing maintained special schools.
Ryan Kelsall, Deputy CEO of Eastern Learning Alliance.
Susanna Connell, CEO of the Diamond Learning Partnership Trust. We're in Hertfordshire, Peterborough and Cambridgeshire, and I represent primaries.
I'm Helen Brooke, and I'm here representing the unions. I'm the District and Branch Secretary for the National Education Union.
I'm Nikki Brown, Head Teacher at Morley Memorial Primary School and also Chair of Cambridge Primary Heads, and I'm here representing LA Primary Maintained Schools.
I'm Sasha Howard. I'm Head Teacher at Meldreth Primary School and I'm here representing Maintained Primaries.
I'm Richard Spencer. I'm Executive Principal for Meridian Trust, representing the Academies sector, and I'm Vice Chair now.
Adrian Ball, Chief Executive at DMAT and representing the Academy sector.
Good afternoon. My name's Michael Atkins. I'm a County Councillor. I'm Vice Chair of the County's Children and Young People's Committee, and I am observing the meeting in that capacity.
I'm Tamar Oviatham, Democratic Services Officer and Clerk to the Schools Forum.
Thank you, everybody. And I promise we won't have to do that every single time that we start a meeting, but I thought it was very useful just for this one, for those people who are actually watching the public feed. Just noticed that actually Councillor Daunton has joined us. Could you just introduce yourself, please?
Yes, thank you. I'm Claire Daunton. I'm the County Councillor for the Fulbourn Division, a member of Children and Young People Committee and an observer on the forum. And just to avoid distraction, I'll now turn my camera off. Thank you, John.
Thank you very much. And we're being joined by Christopher Bennett as well, but I'll let Christopher just settle himself into the room. Thank you. Okay, say, Mark, could you please actually report any apologies for absence?
Apologies for absence received from Mark Vickers, Nadine Gooding-Hebbert, Karen Scott, Karen Taylor and Duncan Ramsey.
Okay, thank you very much. So just really before we get going, obviously just a welcome to those new members of Forum. In particular, Maintain Nursery School Representative Karen Scott and the Academy representatives, Richard Scott, who's joining us, and also Peter Law as well. And as Peter said, also Chair of Cambridgeshire Secondary Heads. And I'm very grateful to those colleagues who have joined Forum and actually sort of taking part in what actually is quite an important body in terms of determining the funding arrangements for Cambridgeshire. I'm also very grateful to those non-voting members who actually joined us, Councillor Atkins, but actually also Helen Brooke as well from the NEU. Thank you very much for being part of Forum. So moving on with the agenda, does any member wish to actually declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest? I should probably declare one for an item later on, which is actually due with growth funding. One of the academies which I'm responsible for actually is currently in receipt of growth funding. I have been informed it doesn't mean I need to actually recuse myself from that part of the meeting, but just for transparency. I don't know if anybody else wishes to do something similar. First of all, Peter.
I'm not aware if it's something I need to declare or not. I'm a trustee for Red Balloon School in Cambridge.
Thank you very much.
And I'm also a recipient of growth funding as well.
Thank you. And Susanna?
We may be in receipt of growth funding for Wintringham as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm sure you made a note of those, Tamar. Thank you very much. Okay, moving on then to reviewing the minutes of the meeting on the 14th of July, which hopefully you have in front of you. I'm going to go through these page by page using the numbering that actually was in the pack, the overall agenda pack that you would have received last week. Please raise your hand if you wish to raise a point of accuracy only. So looking at those minutes, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7 and page 8. Okay, I assume we can agree those minutes as a correct record of that meeting. I was just going to ask John whether you had, and you may not, if there's any update to the item that we actually had around early years and childcare entitlements, which I think you did put an email about, but just in case you hadn't wanted to reference on that.
Yeah, there is some more information came out around the wraparounds provision through primary schools. We've sent out a handbook. In terms of the details of the extension of for 18 months to age 4, we're still waiting clarification, particularly around the funding. I think we're going to have a really important discussion to have in the December January period around how we allocate, where resources go, and the potential implications on the sector of it. So, but at the moment, it's evolving, but we don't have firm confirmed allocations at this time.
Thank you very much, John. Okay, in which case then, and for also to note, there are no outstanding actions actually on the action log. We move to item 5 on the agenda, which is, again, is part of just that administration that we have to do really at the start of the year, which is just the update on appointments. And for this, I'm going to hand over briefly to Tamar.
We've welcomed the new members to the forum. So just to reiterate, new members are Karen Scott for Maintain Nursery School Representative, and for the Academy representatives we have Richard Scott and Peter Law, and then also for non-voting members we have Helen Brooke and Councillor Mike Atkins. And also to note that we have still looking for a Maintain Schools representative to replace Guy Underwood and a Maintained Governor representative to replace Paul Stratford. We're also awaiting a nomination from the Early Years Reference Group ahead of the discussion at the next forum on the early years allocation. And we have also written to colleagues to seek a new representative for post-16 education.
Thank you very much, Tamar. So Schools Forum is recommended to note the new appointments outlined in section 3.1 of the report.
Just one brief point. We now have a Maintain School rep. We're just finalising communication, and they will be here for the next meeting.
Thank you very much. So moving on to item 6, which is Schools Forum, the update to the Constitution. Again, part of what we need to do really at the start of the new academic year. And again, Tamar, please can you introduce this report?
Okay, so very briefly, just to briefly outline the changes, we've updated information on nomination and election of schools members. We've updated information on the election process carried out as far as for each non-school member. We've changed chairman and chairwoman to and vice chairman and chairwoman to chair and vice chair, and updated information on the election process for academy representatives.
Thank you. Just on that last point as well, in terms of the appointment of academy representatives, there will be a meeting of the Cambridgeshire CEOs Forum, which takes place actually at the end of this month, which is the first time that forum is coming together. And what I will do is submit the process by which academy reps are chosen to that group. So it may undergo some change before the next meeting, but I'm not expecting that to be the case. But just to sort of inform all members of that. So does anybody have any particular questions or wish to make a comment regarding the Constitution of the Forum? It is generally a sort of standard approach. There is best practice guidance from the DfE in terms of setting out what the responsibilities of Forum are and actually how it should be conducted. And the vast majority of what Cambridgeshire actually has is taken from that document. We've made some minor adjustments, but otherwise it is as given by the government. Okay, in which case then the recommendation there is that Schools Forum is to note the updates to the Schools Forum Constitution in section 2.1 of the report. In which case then we move on to item 7, which is actually the substance of this particular meeting, which is actually schools budget setting. And we're joined by Jonathan Lewis and Martin Wade, who are going to take us through this report. And what we'll have at various points during this presentation is the opportunity to ask questions after each section. And we're going to focus on really the DCG funding arrangements and illustrative budget modelling, primary and secondary. I'll hand over to John or Martin.
Thank you, Chair. And what we're intending doing is going through a presentation, which is part of your pack. We have tweaked somewhat for more information updates since that time. Nothing material has changed, but just so you're aware that the version on the screen is the latest version, and we'll make sure that is circulated to all schools because there's some important context in here. As we normally do this time of year, we've obviously received the budget settlement, the provisional budget settlement. We've done some initial modelling. We want to explore with you some of the themes, some of the changes. There are some decisions that we need to put in front of you, some areas we wish to get your feedback on. And as John said, we'll stop at various intervals to make sure that information is time to digest and also allow for debate as we go through. So we'll lead you through this section. And as I said, this is the same as you've seen in the last few years, the different elements of the funding, and we'll just briefly explain this to you as we move forward. So in terms of the national picture where we start, obviously you may have read in the national press around the error in the national funding formula. We were given a set of information in July and we received a subsequent update to say there had been some miscalculations. I believe a local authority was left out of the calculations, which meant that the increase per pupil, so they obviously have a quantum of resources. They published a percentage uplift per pupil, and they had to rebase that, including more pupils than in their original calculation. And obviously, you know, that's had implications. I have to say, because we hadn't launched in and done the detailed work on it, we didn't release individual school figures. So in terms of the mechanics locally, it hasn't affected schools, and we've sent out figures based upon the correct quantum. The risk and challenge it did present is that a headline around an uplift was given, and obviously the uplift is now less as a result of that change. So 0.6% was the adjustment. And again, you'll be familiar that the government has obviously gone through the announcement of pay awards, and obviously pay award has been enacted today for teachers. Local government pay award was agreed yesterday, so we're now in a much more certain place around cost. But part of that calculation was the per pupil increase plus grants plus other adjustments, how that now relates to the reality of a funded pay settlement that has come through those arrangements. And as it stands at the current time, because the data is not final, it's quite hard to judge where we are. But the reality of the change was around 4.3 million overstatement in our original allocation that we were calculated. And obviously what we are now looking at is £473 million quantum for our DSG funding, and that's obviously now the basis of this conversation. So as the government normally do, they publish two key documents going forward. One is they publish a indicative per school budget at a national level. And this is an indicative budget because it takes no account of local context, the local funding arrangements, the changes, but they provide a baseline measure. So if you haven't seen this, you can go in. Individual schools have been calculated at a national level. They bear no resemblance to what you're going to receive, but they're there to provide schools with an idea of what they will be receiving. But they are based on, you know, the national position going forward. The other point really probably important to stress now is everything that is being presented is based upon October 22 census. So our figure will change in line with pupil number changes. The context of those pupils will form part of the formula. So as we stand at the current time, we're talking principles with some figures based upon last year. And obviously we will, through the autumn and into the spring, we will look to work with you to update that. The other bit of information that's come out is there is the NFF summary tables. These are the quantums for each local authority area that break down by blocks, and we don't have all the blocks announced yet, but do give the calculation basis for how they work. And it's really important to remember that we are still funded on an historic arrangement. It still reflects the decisions made by county councils and other councils nationally many, many years ago, but we are moving more towards a national arrangement, although there is still differences between local authorities as a result of the historic basis for it. And we're going to share some of the figures in the slides as we move forward. So we're going to start with the schools block. I think it's a really important part of it. And it's a really complicated settlement this year. Not lots of formula changes because there are relatively few, and we will describe how the formulas change, and there's not a huge impact on Cambridgeshire for that. But the the allocation of resources and the mainstreaming of grants does make it a more complicated position. So one of the things that we will do on the 14th of November is we are holding a budget briefing for schools and governors, anyone in finance, and we're going to try and go through the real detail of the changes and how it works. So we're going to cover most of what's in here, but we will offer some more detail with it. The headline measure is that we have had a headline increase in our schools block of 9.4 million, which is 2%. Which sounds incredibly low in the context of a pay award, but what we also have seen is that the grant that went out to schools, which was the Secretary of State's and the Chancellor's top-up grant from 2023-24, has been moved in and mainstreamed within the DSG. So last year, in 23-24, you would have got an allocation at school level for the MASC grant. That will no longer be a separate grant, and has been added to our overall schools block. So if you put the 15.4 million in the context of the 9 million extra, it's probably somewhere in the region of 3.5% extra on top of that as well. So that's going to be complicated. And what it will mean is there will be differences between what you got last year, because that was based on pupil numbers, I think, for that grant from memory. It's now part of the formula. So it will take all the factors, all the allocations, and come through that going forward. The other changes you need to be aware of is that there is a new approach to split site schools funding. We'll cover that later on. We used to have a local arrangement around how we funded split sites. That's now been made national. I think that's a good solution because there was huge variety nationally, but there is an impact locally, and there is some transitional protection. There is a change there going forward. And obviously the other element that we've seen over the last nearly 10 years now, the movement to a national formula is happening. The government are controlling that through changes year on year in the factors in the formula. And again, they've altered the national funding arrangements to move more towards a national funding arrangement. And again, as you know, this forum's view has always been we try and get as close to the national picture as we possibly can, and we're keeping that approach through everything we do there going forward. And on this slide, it really covers some of those factors. So I think we have grasped that issue. I think moving to a national formula does benefit us because we're at the bottom of the funding, and actually following the national funding arrangements does suit us. But obviously the government are slowly moving towards their aspiration, which they promised many years ago, of a formula where there is little local input. There will always be some local input, but now moving into a national formula for these areas. We still don't know exactly when that's going to happen, although there is talks of 2 to 3 years' time that will be concluded. Other national arrangements that have come through, so an MFG, minimum funding guarantee, I think we could probably spend an hour talking about how that's calculated, which we won't do now, but they are protecting schools that have a change in their pupil characteristics, not their pupil numbers, but the characteristics of their pupil, and that is fixed between 0% and an increase of 0.5%. So you can see an element of protection there year on year for schools that see changes in things like free school meal take-up, prior attainment, or things like English as additional language. It's a protection factor that's built within it. And if things weren't complicated enough with mainstream in some grants, the Teachers Pay Additional Grant, the TPAG that came out from this year and is live at the moment, you're receiving allocations of, that will continue to remain outside of the national funding formula. Likely that will be rolled into the national formula in some point in the future. So just useful to understand the complexities, and it's not simply a case of taking last year's budgets and comparing it with this year's if you're going to get back to the overall quantum of resources that are available with that. In terms of the high needs block, and we're going to talk a little bit about the context and challenges around the high needs block in terms of the decision making. We will be bringing back to forum the latest budget position as part of the later elements for it. We're still at the moment doing things like negotiating special school places and going through the process of setting the high needs block going forward. But we are seeing a much reduced increase in this funding. You know, concerning to us is that, yes, we've got a 4.3% increase, but there's no teachers pay grant in this element. There's no other factors around it. So it's going to be a below inflation uplift for that sector going forward. And at a national level, it's 4.3. And in Cambridgeshire, we are at the bottom on the protection factor, as we tend to be with our SEND funding. So we will only see around a £3 million increase, 2.9%, compared to increases of in excess of £8 million that we've had in the last 2 to 3 years. So, huge challenges here with that particular factor. Obviously, as you'll be aware, the high needs block covers all support for children with additional needs. That's the top-ups in mainstream. It's the funding for special schools and AP. It's funding independent school provision and the services to support children. So, the challenges continue with where we are. We will, the government have continued to look at special schools. They've updated and improved a little bit the protection around special schools. There will be a minimum funding guarantee set for those budgets. We often have challenges being clear on what the pupil numbers are and the factors that sit in and around the calculation of some of these protection factors, not so much pupil numbers around minimum funding guarantee, but it is an area where they will have a similar sort of protection to mainstream schools for that going forward. And in terms of other factors, so some of the other factors that used to go into the special school sector, not the whole of the sector, they are being mainstreamed into the main funding arrangements. So we will see an uplift in the funding rate for special school places in line with the mainstreaming of some of these grants and these areas. So just be aware, again, complicated settlement that we're dealing with and the changes that we work through. The third block, the Central Schools Service block, obviously this is a block that funds services that are delivered by the local authority to all schools. We've had this tapering off of protection funding. Our protection, I believe, is now completely removed. This is the last year of we had any protection going forward, so it's now removed from those arrangements. And obviously what that continues to fund is those ongoing services, admissions, copyright, which has seen a huge increase actually in costs coming forward. And obviously we fund you what that cost you, but funding those services continues to be in line with previous years in terms of those overall positions. And we'll share the figures for that later on. John's already mentioned around early years block. Obviously, we're starting to see some of the rates come through. We don't have the figures yet. Obviously, there's announcements that are coming through about how it could work and the details, but the numbers aren't yet worked their way through. And there has been some changes working through. And perhaps more crucially for Cambridgeshire, the maintained nursery school grant continues. For another year, we are going to be back in the same cycle of the challenge around protecting our 7 nursery schools in the county, but for this year there's no issues at the current time aside from the challenges that sector faces. So the overall position is shown in the table there. Hopefully that gives you an idea of the breakdown and the allocation. As I said, it looks on the face of it very low. You've got to add in the grants that are coming in separately, and I think the devil's in the detail now about how the formula will generate for each of these areas against the cost pressures, particularly the cost pressure on pay, because that's the area we need to work through. Hence why we've used these figures to push out those arrangements into schools to give the earliest possible chance to look at those figures and see where the latest position is. Obviously, other areas, we've mentioned the TPAG grant, the Teachers Pay Additional Grant, that will continue. Obviously, confirmation till the end of Parliament, which obviously, is likely to be the last agreement that we have for some of these areas. For pupil premium, the Universal Infant Free School Meal funding continues to go through, and PE and sports premium will continue separately through those grant streams. But a simple formula it is not, and we continue to hopefully signpost and support schools to know where they are. Here are the latest tables. I was quite excited because the version I saw us go at one place, but actually it appears that the latest position, we remain in the same position. So obviously these tables are interesting. I think the one thing, I guess, to reassure us, it's not helping us, but if you look at the local authorities at the top of the table, they're seeing the smallest increase. That's issues such as the minimum funding levels that are kicking in and pulling those local authorities at the bottom up. But, you can see there's some challenges we've given you in there. Some of our statistical neighbour authorities who are most like us. You've got some authorities that are obviously our neighbours as well. I think we are still in a hugely challenging position with our funding, and despite a slightly better increase than some authorities, we've got this ongoing challenge about what the minimum level is required to meet the challenges of what's going on in education at the moment, on top of our specific issues locally as well. So we'll keep an eye on that table when the final DSG does get published, and see if there are any adjustments to it going forward. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Martin now and let him go through the more of the detail in the budgets that we've sent out to schools.
Thank you, John. So as John said, obviously we've tried to circulate some illustrative budgets out to schools, just so you can start to see the potential impacts of the changes that John's just ran through. Again, as John's already highlighted, I think the key thing to remember is that those budgets are based on the 23-24 data sets. So obviously for individual schools, the pupil numbers is going to be the key driver. And as soon as we get the October census information, we'll be able to refresh that information to reflect those changes. The current modelling has assumed the 1% block transfer as per the original safety valve agreement, and we've also assumed an increase in the retained amount for growth funding, which we'll come on and speak a little bit more about later, due to the national changes which are being put forward around that. However, despite that, we've applied the maximum minimum funding guarantee, the 0 plus 0.5%, which is the maximum allowable, and the final figures will also be updated to reflect business rates going forward as well. Okay, so in terms of business rates, maintained schools business rates will be adjusted to reflect any differences in the 23-24 funding and actual bills, as they are usually, obviously, academy bills are already paid directly by the ESFA. So because of the way in which the system currently works, the funding for business rates is lagged in terms of that, and we're seeing quite a large increase in rateable values from this current April, which has obviously impacted a number of schools. Looking forward, however, on the positive note, we've had discussions with our local billing authorities, and the hope is that all of them are going to sign up to the central national scheme from April next year, which will mean actually those bills will then be paid directly by the ESFA, and that would remove the requirement for prior year adjustments for maintained schools, and will also assist with overall cash flow in terms of the process, and will actually help the schools block overall, because there won't be that direct lag that we see from year to year at the moment. So hopefully, as I say, that will be a positive going forward. It does require all of the bidding authorities across the county to sign up for that. I think we have got verbal agreement from all of them that they will be applying to that new scheme from April. So the formula factor unit values that we've applied have been weighted based on overall affordability, as we do in all years, and they all exceed the minimum allowable values set by the SFA. So as part of the move towards the national funding formula, we need to move 10% closer to the national funding formula values year on year, which, as John said earlier, we have always applied that as our methodology. And as part of the change of approach that they brought in last year, each formula factor now has a minimum and maximum allowable value that local authorities can apply. And so we are currently within the threshold of those allowable amounts. Equally, following the introduction of the minimum per pupil levels, which have now been uplifted to 4,610 for primary and just under 6,000 for secondary, we've met those thresholds as part of the overall allocation. What's interesting at individual school level, you can see there's a number of schools that are obviously being brought up to that, so get quite high levels of that MPPL protection. But on the converse side, we've got our small schools, especially, who historically have been way above that MPPL level, who are not seeing the levels of increases of some of the other schools in terms of those formula uplifts. As in normal years, once we get the final settlement, should the overall affordability be an issue, we will have to look at potentially what we do to balance overall within the available resources. Fortunately, the last few years that hasn't been an issue, because the increase in pupil numbers that we've seen from year to year has kind of outweighed those changes in overall funding. But obviously, if there are other elements of the cohort and funding and rates we've already discussed, that could have a potential impact. So on receipt of that data in December, we'll be able to refresh that data to reflect those changes. And this table here shows you, apologies, you probably can't read it on the screen, but it shows you the current factors which have been applied. So the green column to the left shows the unit factor values which were applied in the current financial year. The national funding formula rates without local area cost adjustment applied are in the second column, and then those minimum and maximum allowable values in the next two columns. And in the yellow column is what we're currently applied in the illustrative figures that were circulated out to schools. So, and then you can see the increases which have been applied to each of those. Interestingly, you'll see that actually the percentage increases which have been applied vary from factor to factor. That's in line with the changes they've made in terms of the national formula factors. We've just duplicated and replicated those going forward, and then have scaled them all down within the allowable resources. So last year we were reasonably close with the weighting. I'm not going to say we will be this time, but that's the hope that those final figures won't change too much from that once we get the final settlement. Okay, the local, the formula continues to be a local authority decision in 24-25, and as such will be taken to Children and Young People's Committee in January for a final decision. However, we must consult Forum on the changes to the forum being proposed and any proposed transfer from the schools block. There are no major changes being proposed to the local funding formula other than that continued alignment with the national funding formula that we've already discussed. So the main area that we'll be looking around is the 1% block transfer. John, I don't know if you want to come in at this point.
So you'll be aware of the conversation we had last year around the position with the safety valve. We brought to you the proposal, the plan around how we resolve the deficit that was predicted to be in excess of £120 million unchecked. We obviously went through a process with the government about seeking additional funding, and we were successfully agreed to join that programme. That's brought £100 million into Cambridgeshire to support the SEND challenges that we face. But part of that agreement was an ongoing contribution from schools towards the programme. It's matched by a local authority contribution for this arrangement too. And we're in an interesting place really, because we're here to ask you your view on it to continue. You don't have the decision making because the amount that the DfE agreed in the safety valve is above 0.5%, which is your threshold for it. But obviously we want to work closely with you to understand where we are, what the challenges are, and your agreement that the model we've got, the additional resource it's brought to the county is still in line with our shared agreement around moving forward. So we do have to make a decision, or we have to seek a view from you today. We will then, as a local authority, have to make what's called a disapplication request to the Secretary of State by the 17th of November. And interesting, they're asking us to do that when they've already agreed our model that includes 1% for next year. So it sounds a strange process, but one where I think it's just useful that the forum perhaps debates that and we agree where we are. So I think we'll stop in a second for the section, but just to remind people, you had the whistle top there. It's quite complicated. It probably does need you to sit alongside a set of figures for a school you understand to see the implications of it. And as I said, we're not formally consulting on the budget because we're not making any changes for it. But obviously what we tend to do is open up to our stakeholders, including everyone in this room, the opportunity to comment. We're saying if you can respond to us by the 1st of December with your comments and feedback, we will bring that into the forum agendas through December and January. And obviously I've already mentioned the thrilling Tuesday evening presentation that you're all very welcome to join us, where we will unpack this in a slightly more level of detail and attempt to answer any more questions. So I think that sort of covers the key areas. So I'm back to you, John.
Thank you very much, John, and Martin as well. So what we'll do is sort of split this next bit into two parts, really. Perhaps just some general comments, first of all, on the funding formula overall, in terms of what you heard from Martin and John, and then sort of secondly, in terms of any comments you have about the high needs block transfer, given what John said in terms of actually we're being asked to comment, but because of the nature of the block transfer, this is a decision really which actually ultimately sits with the Secretary of State. But I think it's very important that actually we express a view on that, and hence there'll be a vote on that in a few minutes' time. So are there any particular views that forum members wish to actually share regarding the overall financial settlement and the funding formula, given what Martin was saying as well? There are not substantial changes, obviously, to how the formula is constructed for Cambridgeshire. So I'm opening the floor up to anybody.
Mine's more of a question. Being new to this, how does the formula and the factors compare with our statistical neighbours?
So, as John showed the table in terms of overall funding for the allocations on this table here. So, effectively, this is the allocations that each of the local authorities will have. In terms of how they then apply that to through the actual funding formula, it will vary depending on individual local authorities. However, because everybody is now required to be moving 10% closer to the national funding formula, that is becoming more and more aligned in terms of those factors. So last year was the first year that local authorities had to use a defined set of factors. Previously, there was still some local flexibility, but now the factors that we showed on the other slide, where it's listed factors, they're the factors that every local authority has to use, and each local authority will have a minimum and a maximum, so they'll be within that range. So there is going to be some variables within that, but everybody is now becoming more condensed as we move closer to that national funding formula.
And certainly from the conversations I've had with colleagues, I think we're all getting pushed into a corner now. I think there used to be quite significant differences, particularly around free school meals and how free school meals was allocated and the use of a DACI or not. But to me, it feels like we're pretty much in line now. There's not too much wriggle room, hence why we're not coming here with big decisions. So they are available, though. You can get these tables are available nationally, and you can look at other areas. I'm not convinced we'd do anything different because we wouldn't have any headroom to really make any changes. But obviously, you can comment on these and say, is that looks Martin's flagged already. If you look at some of the DACI bands, they're quite low compared to the Ever 6 free school meals bands, which have increased significantly. So quite an interesting position. I'm conscious I did send out to schools recently some DACI information, and it's quite an interesting set of data in light of free school meal entitlement. So they are available if you need to, and if you feel we need to go and have a look at them, it's probably something we can do, but we will be a year behind because obviously everyone's doing the same conversation now.
Can I just add in terms of the actual formula changes, we alluded to the fact that really the only change this year is to the split site factor. The impact that has for Cambridgeshire is previously we only had one school that qualified for the split site factor. That school actually ends up now losing money slightly because of the national upper thresholds on that, but there is some transitional protection, and there's one further school that now qualifies under the national arrangements in terms of that, but right at the bottom level of the funding. So overall it doesn't make much difference, but for those individual schools it is quite significant. But other than that, in terms of the data from this first iteration, there's very little change in terms of the kind of the impact because of changes to the factors. It's going to be more the changes to the numbers and the cohorts, which are then really going to have the impact when we get that October census data.
Thank you very much, Martin. Any further questions? I suppose I've got a couple of questions. We're obviously rated at the moment, or on the league table, 136th, I think it would have. How long will it take us at this current rate? I did read somewhere that it might take something like 15 to 20 years for us to actually reach the kind of medium. Is that your understanding as well? I mean, obviously it depends on what future government funding looks like, etc., but it's a slow process.
I think it's slow because of some of those protection factors that you've seen. So if you're only changing some of the factors, protection factors by 0%, 0.5%, I think it's optimistic to say 100 years, I think, probably where we are. So I think there's an acknowledgement still that they want to change some of the factors in here. And obviously the key issue will be when they move to the completely national formula. And I suspect we'll see an erosion of all the history and maybe a rebasing of that post. But obviously there will always be an element of transitional protection, which is essentially kicking in here. That's why the uplifts for the London boroughs is still there and they're not on negative. So it's kind of, yeah, smoothing and eroding, I think is probably the best way to say it.
And what we are seeing is that slight kind of shortening of the gap, if you like. So the differential between some of the local authorities is starting to reduce, notwithstanding some of the London boroughs obviously at the top, but we are gradually seeing that kind of change in terms of the overall funding. What will also be interesting this year as well will be what happens in terms of the pupil numbers, because as I say, we've seen that massive increase in secondary, and the unit value for secondary is higher than the unit value for primary. So that will kind of artificially push us up, I think, in terms of the overall numbers. Not that it gives you any more money at individual school level necessarily, in terms of the, because you obviously have the costs associated with those young people. But we are seeing that slight change in the makeup of the factors as well.
Thank you very much. My other question really is where you started in terms of the DfE error, in terms of actually getting the figures wrong. It's probably more of a question for you, John, really, in terms of how has the county council responded to this? I know there are some of the councils that actually have raised their objections in terms of what we might regard as incompetence of the department in terms of actually getting these figures correctly, and have challenged that with the department and actually have asked for them to honour the original amount of money. I know Cambridgeshire obviously hadn't got as far in terms of setting out the district budget in the way that other schools forum and other local authorities had done, but it really is quite poor and has nevertheless had impact on schools which are already sorting out their budgets for next year. Wonder if you can give us an update about that.
Yeah, I think we wanted to understand the position at a school level first, because I think the headlines are the headlines and I think there's planning there, but what does it mean and what the implications are? So one thing we'd very much welcome early responses, reactions to school level. What does it mean? Is there enough money in the system? Secondly, we are obviously part of the Local Government Association. We are working with them. They've made representation and there is a movement around that very view of honour it and push it through. And we are in the process of working with them, as most other local authorities are now doing, to construct a letter to ask that very position. So that hasn't gone off yet because we wanted to be specific about what it meant for Cambridgeshire rather than, oh, there's 0.8% less, because actually we don't know necessarily, and we didn't know the pay award either. That's the key factor, particularly the local government pay award, which is now a critical factor and a figure in that. So that is our intention, to make that representation. But certainly the LGA, who are our association, are being very vocal about the implications behind it.
Thank you very much, John. And obviously, just a note, as we all know, but it's worth stating again, the very poor level of increase for SEND. And one of the biggest pressures that we obviously face is around SEND in the county. And 2.9% increase is really quite poor to respond to those, which perhaps then links on to the next item or the next point of discussion, which is around the high needs block transfer. And again, just whether any forum members wish to comment on that proposal. As I say, it's part of the safety valve funding, but I'd be interested what people's views are. First of all, Richard.
I think as it is our role to comment, I think we should. I think the safety valve intervention programme and the work that's gone into securing that has been invaluable. But I think it's a perverse situation, isn't it, that we find ourselves in, of having to request the Secretary of State for permission to remove more funding from our schools in order to prop up the historically shameful underfunding of the high needs block over a number of years. It's a perverse situation, one that we have no choice in. We have to approve it, obviously, but as we have a role to comment, I think it's right that it's recorded that we're placed in this shameful position as a result of underfunding.
Thank you very much, Richard. I think most of us would echo that point. Further comments?
I think the comment I would make is aligned with what Richard was said, that all of the things that are happening are right, the work that the local authority have done, but I struggle to see how that aligns with the rapid increase in EHCPs. I think we're close to 7,000, is that correct? Over. And the percentage increase when you look at going from, I think, 2.3 to or 2.6 to 4.3% of the cohort, and yet the only response is to either take more money from the schools or for the local authority to ask for more money, but with more restrictions on how that's used. And it doesn't seem to be a response that reflects the need of such rapid growth. And I think it's a real challenge, and it puts schools and the local authority in an increasingly difficult position that neither of us have significant control over.
Thank you very much, Ryan.
So just on sort of following on from Ryan's point, we're in a position where we don't have any control as a schools forum over this transfer. It's in, we've got to do it as part of the safety valve agreement. But again, speaking and getting feedback from schools in advance of today, there's still that perception that it is a vote, because we have in the past not approved the 1%, but we're not in that position now. So what would have made, I guess, those conversations easier is, rather than just presenting it as it is what it is, we've just got to go with it, is be able to look and justify, I guess, what the impact has been today. What are those measures that we're showing? So like Ryan said, with the rise in the EHCPs is still going up and up and up. What are those measures that we're looking at as a local authority to show that this continual 1% each year, what exactly is being measured and proven that things are improving? I get that it's early days, but to be able to go back to schools and say, actually, this is value for money. Yes, we don't have a choice on it, but look what's happened. Look at the direction of travel on these KPIs is in the right direction. And it's having that little bit more information I think would be valuable in delivering this quite difficult message at school level.
Yeah, very, very happy to respond to that. I think it's probably important to put it in context too, that as we stand now, we've seen a 24% increase in EHCPs in the space of a year, which has come through. So we are actually 7,500 EHCP. So when we look at where the money's going, the money is going to maintain the support for those children that are coming in the system. So I think your value for money argument is, if we didn't have this money, that wouldn't be there, and we'd be funding less per pupil. I think, there's lots of things out there that I would point you towards in terms of, progress. We've got more specialist provision now starting. We've got our first ERB hopefully opening in January that will be there to meet some of those needs around SEMH, and there's others to follow. We've commissioned more special school provision that's now available and in the system and supporting. We've actually seen more challenge around EHCPs coming through. So those refusals to assess being really focused in on what the threshold is, where the position is around what the ordinary available provision should be in a school. We are, supporting schools. There's more training support going in at that level. I think what would be helpful perhaps at the next forum, and that was our intention, was to bring back then the progress against all of those measures, but that's just some of the headlines. But I think the problem is that whilst we do those changes, everything's getting more. We're seeing more pressure, more demands. We've got twice as many children in for statutory assessment at this point in time than we had last year, which is a startling figure, really. So it's really hard to show that impact alongside a very much changed quantum of need in the system. But very happy to bring a more detailed list, but I've just given you a few of the areas there. We're very happy to bring out a more detailed report next time.
No, I think that'll be helpful. And is out of county in there as well, because obviously that's the more ERB places we get, more special schools as they come online. Clearly, we want to reduce the amount of out of county placements. So that's probably another one. That's big cost, isn't it, that we've got?
Yeah. Huge cost. And one thing we haven't talked about is that we're trying to deal with inflation on those placements as well. So a £250,000 placement with a 5% uplift is a huge amount of money. So we are diverting that. Actually, some of the interesting things around our safety valve model is that we've released some of that capacity earlier. Children have come out of mainstream into the appropriate provision, which has costed us more in the short term, because if they'd have been in mainstream, it would have been cheaper relatively to those placements. But longer term, we will see that reduction in those numbers coming through, because they're not destined to then go in that more expensive placement. So we're doing a huge amount of work at the moment through our increasing independence work stream. We've identified a number of EHCPs that can be safely and appropriately step down and move towards a different type of support. And we are also looking at those high cost placements with a view to say, what can we do locally? Can we meet that need, particularly on transition? And we're in a much better place now because, you know, the systems work really well together to create provision that we didn't have previously. So yeah, happy to bring back details on that change for the next meeting.
Thank you, John. Susanna?
Yeah, I do think that the LA has come up with some innovative ideas to actually move forward. We're opening an ERB hopefully in January. But I think fundamentally what Richard said is right. I've been on this forum for too long. We have never been funded enough for our SEND pupils. We are failing our SEND pupils, not through what we are doing, but because of the funding. And we're just playing catch up. This 1%, it's not even a finger in the dam. It is immoral, if I'm perfectly honest, and the need is getting greater. Are we talking to the MPs about this? Are we talking to the Labour? You know, we've got an election coming up. Can we start jumping up and down a bit more?
I have very regular contact with our MPs around the challenges with SEND. They're very aware of this position and the challenges, and obviously you'll be familiar that we've had several interactions with ministers as a result of their input, not hugely successfully, but we have had that opportunity to pick that up. I think you're right about it being an important time now. I think, again, the role of Forum is one to represent the sector and, you know, that opportunity that a change in government might present. You know, we also need to bear in mind, we also have a review of SEND and AP improvement plan going on at the moment, which, you know, is obviously progressing, albeit slowly, and the shaping of that. So certainly in speaking internally, it is our intention at the right time to take forward more of that dialogue. There's certainly the ongoing dialogue with MPs is there, and they are being very supportive around the position. I think the challenge at the moment, as the challenge has been set for school budgets and every other element, is that there isn't the resources there and the priorities seem to be elsewhere. But you make a good point. And again, you know, the role of Forum to decide whether you may wish to make representation would be one that I think I'd welcome your input on.
I think I'd echo everything that's been said here. And what I think I'd add to it from a Fenelon perspective and the community that we serve is not to forget as well a wider context of the intersectional disadvantage in some areas of Cambridgeshire where the issue is not just about the SEND, but it's often intertwined with health and also social care. And many of the youngsters that we find to provide us with the most complex challenges are those where it's not just the SEND issue, but these other things. I think it's a little bit, it feels sometimes like a little bit of a perfect storm. And therefore, I would certainly echo the disappointment around the type of money that's involved in the high needs block. And that will also, I believe, make it challenging to see the direct impact of the plans around SEND because other issues also intertwined with these SEND issues as well. And that's just a comment really, I suppose, from the perspective of certainly my school.
Thank you. That's a very valuable perspective as well. And again, Forum has commented before on the lack of input in particular from other sectors, including health, in terms of some of these issues, and that it's left to the schools to actually sort of pick up some of the most complex issues that our young people actually face. Further comments?
I'd just like to pick up on what Susanna said, because as a representative of primary heads, I think the sense of moral purpose that we all come into this job having is weighing very heavy with people at the moment. And I know that we have colleagues who are making decisions to actually leave the sector because they feel that the position is unsustainable in terms of the quality of provision that we are delivering for our most vulnerable children. And by agreeing, I know we don't have an opportunity not to agree, but by agreeing to move 1% of our budget over into the high needs block, where, you know, it is a woefully inadequate figure to deal with that issue, but equally fails to recognise that those children with those special educational needs are still in our schools and are being failed every single day, is a point at which some of our colleagues are saying enough.
Thank you. I think that's an extremely important point in terms of the recruitment and retention challenge we face across our system with teachers and with teaching assistants and the wider workforce, but actually in particular head teachers as well who are dealing with this pressure on top of everything else, including Ofsted, when trying to manage these complex issues actually in the classrooms of schools in this authority. Thank you. Just some concluding remarks from me. It goes back to something John said about actually coming back to the next meeting in terms of discussing where we are with the safety valve. And I would like to invite CPH and CSH if they've got any particular things you want, John, obviously in particular, to address next time we meet at Forum in terms of the progress being made, given obviously some of the complexities that John was talking about there in terms of inflation, etc. But I think that's quite an important conversation for us to have, because one thing we did insert into the Constitution, actually, a Forum for the beginning of this year, is that Forum has a duty, if not necessarily to get into the granular detail of what's happening with SEND, because that more appropriately sits, I think, with CSH and CPH, but actually in terms of that question around value for money, because we are moving that money from the schools block to the high needs block. Absolutely, we're talking about the same children, and if we didn't do this, it would actually, cause the high needs block to destabilize even further. But there is an important role for Forum to sort of say, is this actually working? Is this having the impact that we actually wanted collectively from the safety valve programme? So I do think that's a key question that we need to ask next time round. In response to that, the question that Susanna was raising as well in terms of how we're mobilising MPs and so on. I know that Cambridgeshire is part of the F40 group of local authorities, which on a regular basis challenges and raises questions to the DfE. I'm actually part of that. I do actually receive the communications from that. But I think it's probably useful. I think I understand what the answer might be, but I think we should be inviting our MPs to Forum to actually listen to some of these conversations. I also think we should be inviting ministers as well. And I think we should be inviting the regional director from the DfE to attend this meeting. So perhaps we could action that and sort of progress that for the next meeting, or certainly for the meeting that takes place in January when the final budget decisions are made. Okay, no further comments on that. In which case, then, if we return back to the required actions for the funding formula, no vote is required. It was just a case, obviously, of Forum commenting on the proposed local authority approach. The second item on there, given all the caveats we've talked about, we are required to actually vote on this with the motion that's actually on the screen there in terms of approving the 1% movement between the schools block and the high needs block. So I'm now going to ask you to actually vote on that issue. First of all those in favour of that recommendation, please raise your hands. Thank you. All those against? And all those abstaining? Okay, Tamar, please can you confirm the outcome of that vote?
Unanimous.
Okay, thank you very much, Forum members. In which case, then we'll now move on to the next item, which is actually notional SEN and high needs contingency. And again, I'll hand over to John or to Martin for this one.
Okay, so this is just a reminder really in terms of the notional SEN process that we have. So as in previous years, every local authority is required to identify a notional budget for mainstream schools to help with their duty to meet special educational needs. I think there's still a bit of a misconception out there that this is additional funding. The notional SEN is not a separate formula factor or funding allocation. It's just a generational figure from within the individual funding factors. What might be of interest or might not is the DfE have published some additional guidance about the notional SEN budgets and its operation going forward, and the links included in there. And there are some slight technical changes that they've made in terms of that guidance that, as I say, might be worth looking at in terms of how it actually operates in practice. So for Cambridgeshire, the notional SEN budget is calculated based on the 4 factors listed there: basic entitlement, free school meals and free school meal 6, ADACI and prior attainment. As it stands at the moment, we're still proposing that we're going to have a high needs contingency process as we've operated this year, where we identify those schools with a higher proportion of EHCPs than average based on the census points in May and October, and then look at how that compares to their notional SEN and the X times £6,000 that they're required to put towards those individual EHCPs. We recognise it's not an exact calculation because obviously things do change at a rapid rate, as we've touched on in terms of the changes in EHCPs during the year. But for some schools, it does provide some much needed additional support and funding for them. We've obviously in the year to date, we've allocated the 5/12 allocation to schools, and we'll be looking to do the same for the 7/12 allocation looking forward on receipt of the October census in terms of that actual process. However, obviously that money is going to get more and more stretched as the number of EHCPs continue to increase. So it might be something that we need to revisit as a forum as to whether that process is still appropriate for the level of needs that we're actually seeing in individual schools going forward. Okay.
So just run through then some of the detail of the other blocks. I think we've mentioned much of this already. So the Central Schools Service block, obviously we have seen a decrease in that funding going forward. I'm going to come on to where some of this money does get spent, but I've already mentioned the copyright license will be met from this area going forward. One of the things that we're taking out this year as an adjustment around the high needs block is that previously Forum has agreed with us each year on a contribution towards services provided by the local authorities that support schools, so particularly around our family support workers and others. We are no longer requesting that transfer takes place. We have requested from the council additional funding to fund those elements. So essentially we are freeing up 733,000 that previously went to the local authority, and that will go into our contribution towards the high needs block deficit. So we're trying to realign our spend to be more in line and support those areas. So we are squeezing the central services block to provide that support towards the pressures on the DSG figures. So you can see here in our breakdown of the spend that we make, there's a residual balance of 1.8 million. That is a culmination of everything we're trying to squeeze out of the system, and that will contribute towards the safety valve model. So alongside the £4 million that schools are putting from your 1% transfer, the local authority is also using its resources that could very well be spent on admissions and other services that are under the central schools block budget, but we are targeting that towards that contribution. So obviously we're here today to let you know that's the case. It's a decision of the local authority, but I think it's important to understand the council is contributing towards the challenges. And on top of that, obviously, we've made a cash contribution as part of the safety valve model as well. So there's £9 million that will go in over the next 4 years towards the deficit on the high needs block. We obviously each year come to talk about elements related to maintain schools. There's a slightly different arrangement around top slices. We don't have the ability to top slice schools generally. There is a element that still relates to what we call retained duties funding. And our focus on this is to provide a range of support services, and the dialogue will now happen with the Maintain Schools colleagues over the next extended period to look at this support that we provide. So there's things in here such as additional support around Ofsted, support with some elements of school improvement, our employee assistance program, a range of different offers, and it's our intention that we retain £10 per pupil. This is funding that has never gone out into the maintain sector, and we retain that at the existing rate. So we've gone back to 2017. We've seen schools funding increase by 42%. We've kept it at the same rate throughout, and that obviously provides support for those exceptional cases. And we fund things like redundancies and other challenges for schools and contingency funding through this area. So we will be seeking a view from those forum members, and I think we'll formalise that when we have all three members here to move that forward. But our intention is to peg that at the existing rate. In terms of dedelegation, so these are funding that we on a formulaic basis retain to support a range of different areas. So sorry, I've included contingency on this, but we fund other exceptional costs out of that. But things like our maternity scheme, the ongoing maintain school budget contribution towards facilities time for union reps, and our free school meal eligibility checking. Obviously, these services are provided free to maintain schools, and we deduct these amounts. And again, there are some staffing costs related to this, but we are keeping these rates at the same as they were in the previous year and have been for the previous 3 years before this as well. So our intention is to work on that basis. So John, back to you.
Thank you very much, John. So first of all, does anybody have any comments on anything that John has said actually over the last sort of 5 minutes in relation to obviously the high needs contingency and then around the central school services block before we move to actually approve those at all? No particular comments. In which case then Schools Forum are asked to approve the continuation of the 467,000 to support obviously the admission service, and the continuation also of £3,000 to support the servicing of Schools Forum. And again, this is a vote. So all those in favour, please can you raise your hands? All those against? And any abstentions?
Unanimous.
Thank you very much. So I'll hand back then to John and Martin.
So as I said, with the education function and dedelegations, we'll bring those back in December. So just to reassure people, all those elements will be discussed further. So Martin, I'll hand over you to do the falling roll funds, because that's an interesting one that we want to raise with you.
Yes. So yeah, growth and falling roles is a really interesting one. So for the first time in 24-25, the DfE are going to be allocating funding both based on growth and based on falling roles. It's quite a complex calculation they do, looking at the changes in numbers via areas within a local authority in terms of overall needs. So it's going to be interesting to see what that actually means for Cambridgeshire once we get that data. Previously, the local authorities were required to only apply a falling roles fund for those schools which were deemed good or outstanding. Ofsted, that mandatory condition has now been removed, so it's much more viable for us to actually put that in place in terms of that. However, one condition that has now been added is that it can only be to provide funding to schools where the school's capacity survey shows that the numbers are going to increase again within the next 3 to 5 years. So in some of the initial looking we've been doing, we've seen schools where there is a falling role, but actually it's just on a continual downward trajectory in terms of the forecast. So there is further work we actually need to look at in terms of what that actually means in practice. What's also happened is now that is the DfE brought in a requirement that we need to fund extra classes to meet basic need based on a minimum funding level. So previously we had our lump sums that you agreed on an annual basis that we would fund. However, now they've said that we need to fund based on the primary growth factor, which is 1,550 times the number of pupils times the area cost adjustment in terms of those. As you can see there, the reason why they've said that the primary growth factor is applied is set out in that bullet point at the bottom of slide 30 there. So what that actually means for us is that whereas previously we would fund our differential lump sums for primary and secondary, if we're working on the basis of a class of 30, you can see the calculations in the table there. The 1,550 times 30 pupils times our area cost adjustment would mean actually a significantly higher allocation for growth funding than we have had previously in terms of that, with the same rates being applied to both primary and secondary as per the DfE guidance. So we're currently working with place planning team to work out what that estimate is going to be going forward for 24-25. 23-24 was a higher allocation than we've had previously, particularly because of the increase we've seen in the secondary phase, which is probably the highest increase we've seen in secondary numbers for a number of years. We do get 5/12 of that element back from the ESFA. It's this strange combination where we have to give academies 12/12 of the funding. We then get 5/12 back. So we would get an element of that funding back if we were to fund the year. But we need to work through what that actually means in practice, and we'll bring the kind of the final figures to the December meeting based on our the October census on receipt of that, as well as funding the kind of the in-year growth to reflect the changes in overall pupil numbers. We still fund what the DFE refer to as implicit growth for those new schools which are still growing to capacity in terms of those. So where they're still growing to capacity, we can put what's known as a variation to pupil numbers within our budgets, which we submit to the ESFA based on conversations with the schools and trusts to reflect those increase in numbers over a period of time. So at the moment, these are the numbers we're proposing to put forward for those variations to pupil numbers based on some of the conversations we've had. You'll notice the numbers for Wintringham Park are in red. That's a change to the numbers which were in your original pack following a conversation with the school yesterday, in fact, around the latest forecasts for the numbers at that school. One other thing I was saying to John earlier as well, what we are finding though is in more and more of the instances, there seems to be a differential from what we're submitting to the SFA into what is actually ending up going to the individual schools. So that's something we need to keep an eye on in terms of the actual process. So for these schools, we tick a little box that says guaranteed numbers for guaranteed funding, but sometimes we've seen that actually there is a differential in terms of what's actually coming through in the GAG statements for academies. So I think that's something we'll just need to work with, especially as there are more new schools due to open in the coming years, just to check that those numbers are accurate in terms of the funding. Next slide, John. In terms of the, yes, I already mentioned that the falling roles funding will be worked out nationally based on the differences between the two census points, based on the middle super output area, which effectively is the smaller areas within a local authority area. What we have seen for Cambridgeshire historically, though, is that actually that doesn't necessarily benefit us, because actually although it says those areas are quite small, actually it can take up quite a large area where we've seen growth in some parts of it, reductions in the other, which net out. So we've not necessarily seen some of the benefit you'd expect to see in some of those areas going forward. So I say again, it'll be interesting to see what data we get and what that actually shows. And then the final slide on the growth, it just refers back to the falling roles fund and what I've already mentioned in terms of the mandatory criteria that were required around the SCAP forecasts, and that actually based on our initial analysis, sorry, Richard.
Just a question on that, because is it that it'll only be released if the SCAP data shows a need in the school or in the district?
In the individual school.
But it's calculated at the middle super output area, so you get an allocation there, and then it will be which schools within it.
I just experience of the accuracy of SCAP data in relation to individual schools causes me some concern.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And that's something that we've recognised in conversations with place planning colleagues, and it's something we do need to look at. So as John said, the funding generated by the FE will be based on differences between the census points. Their mandatory criteria about what we can and can't allocate to individual schools is for the falling roles is predicated on the SCAP forecast. So yeah, there is a potential issue there in terms of the accuracy around that data.
Sorry. Just pick on, if none of our MSOAs qualify, we get no money for growth fund for falling role funding as a local authority, even though some schools will be. Okay, fine.
Essentially, yeah, they're calculating it at a geographical area. As Martin says, you could have one school with a falling role, which is but a temporary falling role, and every other school growing. And the net effect of that is no reduction. You don't get any funding. This is where we really need to see the data to understand it, to start to challenge it, and then look at what implications SCAP has on it, because SCAP is not, you know, I always describe school place plan as this dark art. It changes from minute to minute. It would be to do with parental choice. Some of the issues that sit within SCAP and the forecasting that either will push a school up or down. So this is something we struggle to just get our head around the guidance. So we will do some work when we get the census data to understand it. And I think perhaps bringing back a map, a structure to try and show you what it does, because actually what we may want to look at is how we do our planning areas and consider how that may be disadvantageous or could be advantageous to review or look through. But again, we're a bit in the dark. We're trying to work through this, and at the moment we're not entirely clear. Hence Martin's made the comment that we think some primary schools could be eligible, but will they be eligible in the context of their middle super output area? That's going to be the issue.
Sorry, just to clarify, that third bullet suggests, sorry, only a very small number of primary schools could potentially be eligible. Is that additional ones as part of the changing requirement, or is that the sort of the total potential eligibility?
It's based on our initial analysis using the new criteria from the DfE about who would qualify. And it comes back to the point about the SCAP data. There's actually quite a few primary schools who look as though they've got a falling roll between the census points. However, based on the SCAP data, very few of those have got an increase over the next 3 to 5 years, which would then mean that they would qualify for the additional funding through that formula. In terms of, as John said, in terms of the allocation we get from the DfE, we're a bit in the dark at the moment until we see that level of data from the census point. So we could actually end up with quite a large amount of funding, but actually might not be in a position to allocate it because of the criteria linked to the SCAP. So we just don't know. Hence why we want to bring this back to the next meeting for further discussion.
Thank you. I mean, if there's only a small number of schools with a potentially falling roll, it suggests it's unlikely to pop out at the middle layer, but I guess we'll just have to see. Just to say, and you would have seen this with the information I sent out, we have updated the demography forecast. I think demography is one of the most important factors that is now sitting around the formula. If you look at the allocation model, it's that bums on seats factor, isn't it? So it's really important that schools do engage with it, challenge us where it is. We're trying to work through, you know, how we base those figures, why they're different. You know, you'll notice in the analysis we sent out that schools are above PAN because the demand in catchment is above PAN. So it's a complex picture. Because the reality of where children end up is different from the forecast and the approach. And obviously that will come through in the census, but then in the SCAP, it may not show that potentially. So we've got some work to do. And I think I'm glad we floated this, but I'm glad it's confusing to you because we found this incredibly confusing too. So we'll keep working on it and we will come back when we fully understand what it means. And obviously the decision will be, do we do it or don't we? But ultimately, if there's resources there, we have to take it very seriously and think that's the right thing to do, particularly in the context of what we've been dealing with in the county with falling rolls. And, you know, obviously this is slightly different because it's about temporary falling rolls, but we've obviously been faced with closure and other challenges around sustainability of schools with our numbers.
Yeah, and I think, yeah, John's exactly right. And I think the kind of the point around the accuracy of the SCAP data is something that I'm working with place planning colleagues on to try and look at that. I think long gone are the days of just looking at the trend analysis of what's happening and how young people are going to flow through from nursery to primary to secondary. There's much more parental preference involved now and other factors which have led to that. And also there's quite a lot of the mobility. So even within relatively small areas, we're seeing quite a lot of movement between schools as well, which again nets out for the purpose of the calculation, but has a quite significant impact for individual schools in terms of that. So I say we'll try and bring back some more detailed analysis of the census information in December.
You said you worried you might not be able to allocate based on the criteria. I presume there is a clawback mechanism, and we don't have any sort of ability to reallocate should the criteria not be met.
That's a very good question. So effectively what would happen if the criteria doesn't met, my understanding is that money would effectively just go into the schools block allocation. So effectively the growth and falling rolls fund are part of the schools block. It's just another kind of factor element of that. So if we, in the same way that we hold back an amount for the growth fund, if we didn't hold the amount back for the falling rolls fund, it would just go out as part of the allocation. So again, that's part of the consideration we need to look at as part of the funding.
To be really clear, it's not free money, it's off the bottom line, but it's a protection factor for those schools that have those concerns, those challenges.
Obviously, you know, I've talked a little bit about closure. We've had Great Gidding close this year. That will release money back into the sector as well. So there is, you know, it's complex, but it's all bottom line. So it's a chunk off where we are. And that's where the decision from Forum will be quite important to decide, is that the right thing to do? But you can see the figures aren't huge, but meaningful nonetheless.
It's a phrase I've used before, but it's still the same pot of jam. It's just been spread in different directions. Martin, anything else you wanted to add? Thank you very much. Any further questions relating to either the growth fund or the potential falling roll fund? Okay, in which case then, thank you. We appreciate, obviously, you come back to the next meeting with hopefully some clarification. In which case, as it said on the screen there, basically Forum just required to note those points and perhaps reflect on it. Again, I think they're important questions really for primary and secondary representatives and all the other sectors really, because certainly the drop in primary school pupils, for example, in various areas of the county could have quite a significant impact going forward. So I think this needs to be very much a live discussion, and that Forum is appropriately reflecting what the views of those various sectors actually are in terms of making that decision going forward.
Okay, we just finalised then where we are. So this is the next steps and timescales. You can see the path through consultation or feedback. Obviously, we will come back together as the Forum on the 13th of December, noting the request. Well, we'd already intended to share the high needs block, but obviously that refinement of the model. We are not sure when the next iteration of the budgets with the October 23 census would be. We kind of hoped it might be ready for the 13th. We are led to believe it may not be, and that's going to concertina into other dates later on. So it may be we may not get that until January. So we will need to obviously keep in contact. There may be the requirement to have other correspondence with you or other meetings. Obviously, what we're intending to do at the moment is hit that 12th of January date for you to essentially review the final budget, because obviously the decision making will go to the CYP committee on the 16th of January with a view that we then submit on the 19th of January. Again, what we will try and do, as we've done in the past, is keep updating schools on the latest figures. As we get those updates go through, we will push them out. And obviously that dialogue with the rest of the sectors, nursery and special school, will continue over the autumn, but that will be finalised later as the allocations are updated or the final funding for early years is received. So that's the path, same as last year, but just be warned on that date around the DFE information may be later coming through the system. Thanks, John.
Thank you very much, John. Does anybody have any comments on those next steps? Okay, thank you very much. In which case, then we move to, I think, what is the last item on the agenda, which is the agenda plan. Can I check, Tamar, whether there are any additions to the forward plan in addition to what John just said?
None that I'm aware of.
In which case, then, can I ask Forum, please, to note that agenda plan? The next meeting of Forum, as John was just highlighting, is actually intended to be the Wednesday, the 13th of December. At the moment, I think that's a virtual meeting, isn't it? But bearing in mind what we said about potentially inviting other representatives to actually attend, it might be better if that's actually in person. So it might be something we need to reconsider, but obviously that depends upon the availability of a meeting space and so on. So we'll communicate with you as soon as possible regarding that. And just before we finish this meeting, what I would like, unless of course you have a sort of parental note that says you have an exemption, actually what we'd like to do is to actually have a photo opportunity for those voting members of Forum, because we're actually something we would like to share with actually the wider sector, so they actually know who their representatives are on Schools Forum. And perhaps, John, if that could be included in the schools newsletter that goes out. I'd say if you have a particular reason why you can't have your photo taken, then please obviously let me know. Otherwise, therefore, do not escape. Please do stay so we can actually have that photo opportunity. But otherwise, unless anybody's got any further questions they want to raise this afternoon, can I just thank you very much for your attendance and the point raised by a number of members around the room, that moral purpose, which is why we're here. Some of this is around obviously talking about essentially retained funding and everything else, but actually underpinning this is doing the right thing for all the young people actually in Cambridgeshire. And we should not lose sight of that as we continue to make sometimes quite difficult decisions with the limited amount of funding that we continue to receive in Cambridgeshire. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon. And for those who have been watching on the live stream, I now declare this meeting closed. Thank you.